So before I get into the video, I want to say that I follow the video creator. It actually was one of my very first follows a long time ago. It's a rare instance where the TikTok algorithm pointed me in the right direction. He's wicked smart in military history and strategy, so I like a lot of what he says, and I never disagree with him. And I think this will probably be the first time that I disagree with his assessment in general, and it comes with many caveats. He's not wrong with what he's saying. It's just I'm taking it from a different angle as to why I think China probably isn't the number 2 navy. Certainly Russia's not the number 2. I agree there, but I'll talk about it kind of from my perspective relative to the world without the U.S., and I'll talk about why the U.S. should be removed, but also the dynamic of naval power within the region and the world writ large when it comes to China. Now, I do believe the Chinese Navy is only really powerful on paper, but that's only when you place it in the context of against the U.S. Remove the U.S. from the global stage, and China is a very formidable Navy. I agree. Like I said, Russia's not number 2. They are showing their debilitating incompetence across all facets of warfare, and I have no reason to believe that doesn't translate to the Russian Navy. So why am I removing the U.S. Navy? Well, it's pretty obvious. I've talked about this before. The U.S. Navy is by far the most powerful Navy in the world. In fact, it's probably more powerful than the next 3 navies combined. And from a pure power projection standpoint, the U.S. developed its naval capability differently than every other country. The U.S. has the luxury of creating an expeditionary navy because we don't need a defensive naval capability. The U.S. mainland is largely uninvadable by our foes. So unlike Japan, the United Kingdom, China, we are able to focus on exporting our navy to do our bidding around the world. And there's no need for coastal defense. The U.S. is probably the only navy that can successfully prosecute a multi-theater campaign, meaning the U.S. Navy can fight simultaneously in the Pacific, the Atlantic, the Persian Gulf, the South China Sea, which I know is a part of the Pacific. And no other country can do that, not even close. Taken by itself, the U.S. Navy is probably a top 10 military power by itself. And a single carrier battle group has the capability of changing the geopolitical and geostrategic landscape of any country that it decides to park its ass off of. And that's before the Ford-class carrier, which is being developed. The Nimitz-class carrier is the most advanced carrier currently floating on the ocean, and the U.S. was like, that's not advanced enough. So they created the Ford-class, which is largely unsinkable and probably will be the premier platform for decades. So where I disagree is that I just don't think China is number 2. But as I said, there comes with some caveats. China can operate well near its borders. It cannot, once it gets past the first or second island chain, it becomes very difficult for China to project any kind of naval power. And this is why I would put Japan at number 2. China would be number 3, but I think Japan is a more powerful navy than China. And there's a few reasons. The first of which is that distance, the logistics chains, the ability for China to conduct operations further than the South China Sea. I just don't think China has that capability, whereas Japan does. Unlike the U.S. Navy or even the Japanese or British Navy, the Chinese is largely a coastal defense force. It's just a large enough one that they require aircraft carriers. It's a long coastline, so it makes sense to integrate coastal defense in with naval projection within the region. But they can't project further than the South China Sea in any meaningful way. And when I say the first island chain, that's like Taiwan, Philippines, first and second island chain, really. So their power in naval capacity derives from their regional location. Once they leave their region, their power diminishes significantly. China basically developed the capability to give countries such as the United States enough pause to go, should we really send naval forces for Taiwan? Because China has built up robust power capability in the region. No one really thinks China can come over to the U.S. and defeat the U.S. with its Navy, whereas there's a real thought process and threat to China that the U.S. Navy could do that. But like I said, once they leave the security of the first island chain, Chinese simply just don't have anything. They don't have the ass end to conduct war fighting in a blue water capability. And it largely derives from what they have floating. First and foremost, they have 2 carriers. The U.S. has 11. Japan actually doesn't operate similar carriers, but I'll talk more about what their carriers are like here in a moment. The Chinese carriers are jump carriers, meaning they use like a BMX style ramp to launch their carriers off into the air. This means that they can't be full of fuel. They either require in-air refuel en route to their target, or the target has to be close enough. This means from a pure launch standpoint, US and Japanese aircraft have a longer range when it comes to total flight time to target. And the reason the Japanese have such a good range is they have taken their helicopter carriers, which is kind of a misnomer because they really weren't designed for helicopters, but instead for F-35 vertical takeoff. Fielding these smaller helicopter, quote unquote, helicopter carriers means that they're more maneuverable, require less fuel, but they have essentially a carrier capability with F-35s. And it was revealed 2 years ago that the Izumo class carrier was actually designed for the F-35, not so much for helicopters, which many military analysts already suspected. That being said, Japan has said they're going to build their own carrier here starting in 2018. I'm not sure where they are in the process, but it's supposed to field a more traditional style carrier. Funny thing is Japanese helicopter carriers are bigger than Italian aircraft carriers, so it's not something to take lightly. Even though China has carriers, China doesn't possess anything like the F-35. They have no 5th-gen fighter to launch from a naval platform. Only the Su-30 and J-11, which are 4th-gen fighters, can launch from their carriers. And there's some skepticism that the Chinese 5th-gen quote-unquote fighter really is stealthy anywhere other than from the front. And that kind of points to the bigger scenario here. Everything Japan fields is more advanced than China. So while China operates in terms of tonnage a larger navy than Japan and even the US, China's capability is similar to that of Russia's when it comes to like tanks. Build a bunch of them, don't necessarily make them quality, but we'll try to overwhelm them with number. And we've seen in Ukraine that doesn't necessarily work. The Japanese destroyers are some of the most advanced in the world, and sheer numbers don't tell the whole story when you try to compare the apples to apples, China to Japan. Japanese warships are much larger than Chinese warships. They're more advanced. They carry better defenses. And although China deploys 3,300 naval missiles, Japan only 1,600, there's a quality problem for China there as well, as China has been shown to struggle to hit moving targets which ships move. So for the record, the U.S. fields 10,000 plus advanced ship missiles. In 2020, Japan launched one of the most advanced stealth submarines in the world, the Taige class. They have one of the most advanced torpedoes in the world. Japan has the highest performance vertical launch anti-submarine rocket in the world. Japan built its destroyers based on the Aegis system, which is what the US and UK and others use, and it's incredibly effective. And they did this jointly with the United States. And there's one final thing that I would say that shifts the balance of power in favor of Japan, and that is their personnel and training. Every 6 to 8 months, the Chinese Navy loses about 40% of its enlisted force. They have a middling NCO corps, which for countries like the US, the UK, and Japan is essential for success. China, just like Russia, just doesn't have the experience in its ranks, and that would show. So in general, I don't think China would lose to Japan in its backyard, just like I don't think Japan would lose to China in its backyard, because that cancels each other out. Where I see China being a more powerful naval force is in open ocean fighting, in fighting where there isn't support from the Japanese or Chinese mainland, where it's truly just Navy versus Navy without coastal support. And I think Japan wins that fight 9 out of 10 times, which is why I would say Japan is the more powerful Navy across the board than China.